Now, my main conclusion is that the combination of xenophobia and Eurocentrism lies at the heart of why these works of art have not been identified as Oriental or Indian mythological scenes. And my own personal motivation is not revisionist history per se, but the history that we are not told simply because these classical scholars choose to focus only on Mediterranean Europe and the Near East to the exclusion of West and South Asia. A more complete narrative of world history is only possible with the input of researchers who adopt a more holistic approach to the subject, which is what I believe I have done. There is a double standard, unfortunately, in the academic circles. There are far more Western scholars of European descent who study Oriental history and myth, including the field of Indology. But compared to that, there are very few scholars of Asian or African, that is non-European descent, who study classical history and myth. That is the Greek and Roman myth and culture. So this imbalance of having too many scholars in one field and not enough scholars in the other field, and lack of diversity, this imbalance leads to a Eurocentric world historical view. Returning to the same issue of why these works of art, including the Boston Hydria, have not been identified as Oriental mythological scenes, I have the following quote from Jaap Hemmelrich, who does indirectly concede the potential mythological content on the Boston Hydria. Like the Italian author Raffaella Bonato previously, Hemmelrich is non-committal, however. He writes, the two painters had a great liking for narrative scenes and a surprising knowledge of mythology and literature. They were fond of myths that are rare or even lacking in the work of other studios. This preference for unusual stories, which are sometimes hard to identify, suggests that certain scenes, so far not regarded as mythological, may represent definite myths as well. So he really echoes Bonato, who also stated previously, as we showed on an earlier slide, that the Boston deer hunt cannot be defined exactly and does not necessarily correspond to a mythical tale not otherwise attested. So they're very close to the truth, but are still hesitant to go any further than kind of knocking on the door. Now, if you compare that to another scholar's remarks, Otto Brendel's remarks about the Campana slabs, we see a more affirmative statement that they realize they must be mythological. So he says that about the meaning of these representations on the Campana plaques, general agreement has not yet been reached, though obviously the abduction of a young woman by a winged being calls for some mythological explanation. So he does realize that there needs to be some kind of mythological explanation, but he's a little bit incorrect with his wording because he's calling it the abduction of a young woman by a winged being when it really is a rescue of a young woman by a winged being. And I think that that's where, if they would compare the Caeretan Hydria in Boston to the Campana plaque that he's referring to, they would see the distinction between the abduction of a young woman versus the rescue of a young woman. And that's the problem, is also not only they're not able to identify definitively whether the scene is mythological or not, but they're not doing enough comparison with other scenes that are similar and could reveal, the mythical origins. So I want to present another very important quote from an Etruscan scholar who realizes that the Etruscans probably represented some Oriental stories in their artworks. The scholar's name is Otto Brendel, and in his book Etruscan Art, on pages 66 to 67, he writes, by this time, which is the beginning of the 6th century, the Etruscan artists had acquired sufficient freedom and mastery of representational form to attempt, occasionally, the rendition of subjects which lay outside the limits of the Greek parent art. The possibility must at least be taken into consideration that Etruscan works occasionally represent subject matter acquired from Oriental art, which may not be immediately obvious to a modern critic, because it has been translated into Greek or Greco-Etruscan techniques and forms of representation. And this is an extremely important observation, and it's thought-provoking for all modern scholars. It basically summarizes everything that I have presented to you in this, in all these slides. The translation of the subject matter of the Valmiki Ramayana is not something that is immediately obvious to the modern classical scholar, but that's what has happened, and it has been translated into the Ionian / Etruscan techniques and forms of representation. And so therefore it's not easy to see it on the surface immediately, especially for somebody who's not familiar with Oriental myth or Indian myth. In addition, when Brendel says that the possibility must at least be taken into consideration that Etruscan works occasionally represent subject matter acquired from Oriental art, he's basically pleading. He's essentially pleading with the classical scholars in the Western world to at least consider the possibility that this is an Asian myth rather than a Greek myth. And he's quite right to do that and to condemn, in essence, their Eurocentric views and xenophobia. And finally, I would just like to draw your attention to the graphics below. Once again, we can see the similarity between the Indian depiction on the right of the golden deer chase and the Ionian representation of it on the left. The Indian painting on the right was made in Jaipur in the 19th century, and it actually is one half of a full painting in which on the bottom you see the abduction of Sita by Ravan, or actually the demon Ravan disguises himself as a beggar while Rama is distracted by hunting a golden deer in this top scene. So in the bottom scene there is Ravan approaching Sita as a beggar, and in this top scene, which I'm displaying here on this slide, is Rama distracted along with his younger brother Lakshman to the left of him while hunting the golden deer, which has two heads, again metaphorically indicating the elusiveness of the deer. And also, normally if we are going to be very technical or by the book, only Rama is the one who actually hunts the golden deer, whereas Lakshman only meets him in the forest after he has killed Maricha in the actual poem of Valmiki. But there's obviously liberties taken by artists where you see these variations where Lakshman also joins Rama in hunting the deer. So that's why we should not be surprised if the Ionian artists also did the same thing with, what we see on the Caeretan Hydria. We see Rama and Lakshman, the two nude youths, hunting the golden deer Maricha. To finish this presentation, I would like to definitively declare that we have proven exhaustively that the Caeretan Hydria No. 2 in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts depicts the golden deer episode of the Valmiki Ramayana. What happened here is an amazing combination of Ionian art and Indian legend. They were brought together in an Etruscan workshop from the late 6th century BC. It's a remarkable story that has never really been told, but needs to be told. So, thank you. This painting from Jaipur, Rajasthan, is actually kept at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and you can see it yourself at the link that I've provided below the painting on this slide. So, if you care to analyze it further. Now, this presentation has been thorough and complete, in my opinion, but I wanted to give another example in this appendix of the golden deer episode in ancient stone sculpture rather than medieval painting. This carved stone relief that you can see on this slide, depicting two simultaneous events from the Valmiki Ramayana, should be all too familiar by now. It dates to the Kushan period, which is placing it around the 2nd to 3rd century AD, and comes from ancient Gandhar, located in what used to be northwest India, or what is now modern Pakistan. So this is in the very ancient past compared to the medieval paintings that we've been using for comparison. And also, because Gandhar was near the eastern frontier of the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC, and eventually became part of it under Darius around 520 BC, it is my contention that Indians in that region were the ones who narrated the story of Rama to Ionians and Persians when they came into contact with them, in that second half of the 6th century. And this oral tradition then traveled west to Ionia very quickly due to the fast transportation network within the Persian Empire, which was also vast. That's why they talk about the Royal Road from Susa to Sardis. So it was a very vast and fast transportation network. What is important to note about this particular work of art is that it is one of the oldest sculptures from India that depicts the golden deer hunt as well as the moments before Sita's abduction, where Ravan approaches her. So this work of art is found at the British Museum, and you can see that in the link that I provided here. Now, the British Museum does give us a description of this scene, and they are non-committal, though, about whether the subject is actually the Ramayana. They say that the subject may be a version of the Rama legend or a theme shared with it. So they're not totally sure themselves, but I think as we go through this analysis, I think most people will be certain that it must be, or at least there's a very high probability that it is. So in the middle scene here, the British Museum tells us that an archer, which I believe is Rama, is holding the bow and is ready to strike his quarry, which is the two rearing cervids that are to the left of Rama, and the nearer one is looking over its shoulder. So if we compare to the Caeretan Hydria, we can see that there's almost a one-to-one match here, where you have multiple deer again that are being portrayed, but the actual reality is that it's one deer, and it's just moving in a sequence away from Rama. And they're both rearing, meaning that they are standing on their hind legs in a panic. And that is, again, in accordance with what we see in the Caeretan Hydria with one of the poses. And they're also showing that one of them is looking over its shoulder, which is, again, the same twisted head that we see in the middle deer of the Caeretan Hydria, the middle pose in the Caeretan Hydria. So really, I mean, it's so close to the Caeretan Hydria, and it's also one of the oldest examples from India. So that should really clue us in that this is probably how the Ionian artists really understood it. That this comes the closest to what the Ionian artists were really, picturing or imagining themselves. And you can see that the leftmost cervid is not looking back and it's fleeing, fleeing away, and that's analogous to the leftmost deer that we see on the Caeretan hydria. Now, if we look at the other scene on the left side, Ravern is posing as an unhappy suppliant, in the British Museum's words, and he's approaching Sita, who is seated in a partly leaf-covered hut, according to the British Museum. And this hut is what is acting as kind of a dividing line between the two scenes. And also in the rightmost part of the middle scene, we see that Lakshman and Sita are probably the two standing figures behind Rama, who is the archer hunting the deer. So really, I mean, it's again the same, two events, the abduction of Sita and the deer hunt, just as we have seen throughout this presentation, including with the main work of art that we've been analyzing, the Caeretan hydria from Boston. I think this should be as conclusive as it gets.